He held the crown jewels in his personal vault, yet he died screaming at empty corners. Cardinal Beaufort poisoned a hero king and starved a queen to become the master of England. But in his final moments, he didn't pray, he tried to bribe the Grim Reaper, offering his entire fortune for just one more hour. What kind of monster sees demons instead of angels, and realizes too late that his gold is actually the weight dragging him to hell? Through heavy velvet drapes, the thick and cloying scent of frankincense seeped into the royal chambers, struggling in vain to mask the underlying stench of rotting flesh. In the gloom, broken only by the flickering of dozens of beeswax candles, the withered body of an old man tossed restlessly upon a massive bed, his skeletal fingers clawing convulsively at the edges of the linen sheets as if trying to anchor himself against a slide into the abyss. This was no ordinary elder facing his twilight, but a man whose personal fortune exceeded the treasuries of entire kingdoms, a prince of the church who could purchase armies with a wave of his hand, yet who now found himself utterly impoverished in the face of the one debt he could not pay. The man gasping for breath against the damp pillows was Henry Beaufort, Cardinal of England and the Bishop of Winchester, a titan who had dominated the political landscape for half a century. For decades, his will had been the law, and his gold had fueled the fires of the 100 Years' War, sustaining the English crown when taxation failed and kings grew desperate. He had been the shadow behind the throne, the architect of dynasties, and the cold calculator of national destiny. Yet here, in the suffocating silence of his bedchamber, the purple robes of his high office lay discarded on a nearby chair, looking less like a symbol of divine authority and more like a costume abandoned after a long and bloody play. It was April of the year 1447, a spring that brought no warmth to the stone walls of the Wolsey Palace where the cardinal lay dying. Outside, the world was waking up to new life, but inside this room, time seemed to be warping, bending under the weight of the dying man's terror. He had spent a lifetime amassing power, believing that control was the ultimate virtue, but as the fluid rattled in his lungs, the absolute control he had wielded over the English court dissolved into frantic helplessness. The grand tapestries on the walls, depicting scenes of biblical judgment, seemed to mock him now, their woven figures staring down with accusations that no amount of gold could silence. Witnesses present in the room, men of the cloth and hardened servants alike, would later whisper that the shadows in the corners of the chamber were behaving unnaturally, pulling together and stretching out like grasping talons independent of the candle flames. The dying man was not merely struggling with the physical agony of organ failure, he was screaming at invisible intruders, his eyes wide with a primal panic that unsettled even the most devout priests at his bedside. He spoke not to God, but to the empty air, bargaining with unseen entities, his voice cracking as he offered the entirety of England's treasury for just one more hour of breath, one moment of delay before the inevitable judgment. The immense wealth of Cardinal Beaufort was the stuff of legend, a vast accumulation of riches that had made him the greatest usurer in the history of the realm. He had lent vast sums to the crown, effectively holding the mortgage on the monarchy itself, and in doing so, he had bought legitimacy for his line and dominance for his faction. But as he lay thrashing in the sweat-soaked sheets, the irony of his life's work became a cruel torment. The chests of gold stored in his vaults were as useless as dust against the encroaching darkness. He realized with a terrifying clarity that while he could bribe popes and kings, the entity standing at the foot of his bed had no use for coinage stamped with mortal faces. There was a palpable sense of dread hanging over the room, a heavy atmosphere that made it difficult for the attendants to breathe, as if the sheer weight of the cardinal's sins was displacing the air. They remembered the rumors that had dogged his steps for years, whispers of poison administered in secret cups, of political rivals who died conveniently in their sleep, and of the ruthless destruction of anyone who dared oppose his ambition. These were not merely political maneuvers, they were mortal sins, and in this final hour, the ghosts of the past seemed to be gathering to witness the fall of the men who had sent them to their graves. Specific among the phantoms that haunted the delirious mind of the cardinal was the memory of his own nephew, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who had been found dead only weeks prior. The rivalry between the two men had torn the court apart, a bitter feud that ended only when Gloucester was silenced forever, clearing the last obstacle from Beaufort's path. Now, as the cardinal faced his own end, the suspicious timing of the death transformed from a political victory into a damning indictment, a spectral weight that sat upon his chest and crushed the air from his lungs more effectively than any disease. The priests muttered their Latin prayers in hasty, trembling voices, trying to build a wall of holy words around the bed, but their rhythm was constantly broken by the cardinal's sudden, terrified outbursts. He would momentarily lucid, grabbing the wrist of a confessor with a grip of surprising strength, demanding to know if death could be hired, if there was no loophole in the divine law that his influence could exploit. It was a shocking display for a man of the church, revealing that beneath the Cardinal's hat lay not the soul of a shepherd, but the calculating heart of a merchant who could not understand why his greatest transaction was being refused. Even the architecture of the room seemed to conspire against him, the high vaulted ceiling disappearing into gloom, creating the illusion of a deep pit rather than a sanctuary. The candlelight caught the sheen of sweat on his forehead, illuminating the map of wrinkles that told the story of a life spent in frown concentration and ruthless plotting. He had been the Red Prince, a man born out of wedlock to the mighty John of Gaunt and later legitimized, spending his entire existence proving he was greater than his birthright, but in these final moments, he was stripped of all titles, reduced to a trembling creature fearing the predator in the dark. As the night wore on, the distinction between the material world and the spiritual nightmare blurred, with the Cardinal staring fixedly at a point in the room where nothing existed but shadow. His breathing became a ragged, rhythmic rasp that sounded like the tearing of silk, a sound that would haunt those who heard it for the rest of their lives. He was not going gently, he was being dragged away, his spirit clawing at the mortal coil, terrified of what lay on the other side of the veil, leaving the living to wonder if the rumors were true that he had sold his soul for power long ago, and the collector had finally come to claim what was due. The story of Henry Beaufort began not in the splendor of a throne room, but in the shadowed corners of illicit romance and scandalous whispers that echoed through the courts of Europe. He was born into a world that viewed him as a mistake, a living testament to the passions of his father, the mighty John of Gaunt, and his mistress, Catherine Swynford. In the eyes of medieval society, blood was destiny, and Beaufort's blood was considered tainted from the very moment he drew his first breath in the year 1375. This stigma of bastardy was a heavy cloak to wear, a permanent mark that signaled to the world that while he might be of royal stock, he was never intended to rule, existing merely on the periphery of the great Plantagenet dynasty that held England in its iron grip. The immense power of his father, the Duke of Lancaster, was the only shield Henry possessed against a world that despised illegitimate offspring. John of Gaunt was the wealthiest and most feared man in England, a titan who could bend the laws to his will, and he fought tirelessly to secure a future for his children born of Catherine. Through sheer political force and papal intervention, the Beaufort line was eventually legitimized, a legal miracle that theoretically washed away the sin of their conception. However, the victory was bittersweet and incomplete, marred by a single, devastating clause inserted into the Parliamentary Act that would haunt Henry for the rest of his days. The phrase "excepta dignitate regally," except for the royal dignity, was a barrier of ink and parchment more impenetrable than any stone wall, explicitly barring him and his descendants from ever claiming the crown of England. This exclusion from the succession was the defining trauma of Henry Beaufort's life, the moment that hardened his soul and sharpened his ambition into a weapon. He realized that if the laws of men forbade him from wearing the crown, he would instead own the men who wore it. Denied the ultimate title, he turned his gaze toward the only other power structure that rivaled the monarchy, the Holy Catholic Church. It was a calculated pivot, devoid of spiritual epiphany, driven by the cold logic that the Church offered a pathway to a different kind of supremacy, one not limited by borders or bloodlines, but fueled by the universal language of gold and influence. He rose rapidly through the ecclesiastical ranks, his ascent greased by his father's name and his own terrifying competence, eventually securing the bishopric of Winchester, the wealthiest see in all of England. Winchester was not merely a religious post, it was the financial heart of the kingdom, the center of the lucrative wool trade that served as the lifeblood of the English economy. As bishop, and later cardinal, Beaufort sat atop a mountain of revenue derived from the vast estates and the taxes levied on the golden fleece of the English sheep. While other noblemen squandered their fortunes on tournaments and fading castles, Beaufort hoarded, invested, and multiplied his assets with the acumen of a Florentine banker. He transformed the episcopal palace into a counting house of continental proportions, where the clinking of coins was heard more often than the chanting of psalms, and where the true nature of his power began to take shape. The England of the early 15th century was a realm perpetually teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, its kings possessing grand ambitions but empty treasuries. The crown lived beyond its means, entangled in endless conflicts and the extravagant maintenance of a royal court that demanded luxury it could not afford. It was into this void of insolvency that Henry Beaufort stepped, not as a savior, but as the indispensable predator. When the king needed to pay his household guard or suppress a rebellion in the north, there was only one man with enough liquid capital to provide the funds immediately. Beaufort opened his coffers to the monarchy, but never as a gift. Every coin that left his vaults was a shackle, forging a chain of debt that bound the ruler to the subject. These loans were transactions of immense complexity and risk, often secured against the very symbols of royal authority. There were moments in history when the crown jewels of England, the ancient regalia of St. Edward, sat locked in the chests of Henry Beaufort as collateral for the cash he advanced to the state. It was a profound humiliation for the monarchy and a silent triumph for the bastard son of John of Gaunt, to hold the physical manifestation of the sovereignty he was denied, keeping the crown in a box while the king begged for the means to rule. This leverage made him untouchable, a shadow king who could dictate policy by threatening to close the tap of funding that kept the government functioning. The true scale of Beaufort's financial empire, however, was revealed with the escalation of the 100 Years' War. When his nephew, Henry V, decided to renew the ancient claim to the French throne, he launched a campaign that required resources far beyond the capacity of traditional feudal levies. War was becoming a modern enterprise, an industrial grinder of men and material that demanded payment in gold, not just loyalty. It was Beaufort who stepped forward to finance the impossible ambitions of the young king, underwriting the invasion that would become the stuff of legend. The fleets that gathered at Southampton, the thousands of arrows fletched for the longbows, the salted beef and barrels of ale, all were purchased with the Cardinal's money. Every English archer who stood in the muddy fields of France, drawing a yew-bow with the strength to pierce plate armor, was effectively a mercenary on Beaufort's payroll. The iconic victories of the era, including the miraculous triumph at Agincourt, were fueled by the credit lines extended from Winchester Palace. While the poets and chroniclers sang of the king's bravery and the favor of God, the pragmatic reality was that the English army marched on a road paved with Beaufort's silver. He had monetized patriotism, turning the crusade for France into the ultimate investment opportunity, where the returns were measured in looted cities and ransom payments from captured French nobility. The system Beaufort created was a self-perpetuating engine of wealth extraction that blurred the lines between public war and private profit. As the English armies ravaged the French countryside, the spoils of war flowed back across the Channel, and a significant portion of this plunder found its way into the Cardinal's hands as repayment for his loans, often with exorbitant interest disguised as gratuities to avoid the Church's ban on usury. He profited from the destruction of France just as he profited from the desperation of England, standing at the center of a vortex of violence that enriched him with every campaign season. The blood spilled on the fields of Normandy was transmuted into gold bars stacked in the cellars of his residences. This immense accumulation of wealth created a gravity well that distorted the politics of the entire realm. Men of lesser fortune looked upon the Cardinal with a mixture of awe and revulsion, calling him the rich Cardinal, with a sneer that barely concealed their envy. He was an anomaly in the feudal order, a man whose power did not rest on the number of knights he could call to banner, but on the ledger books that tracked the insolvency of his peers. He bought up forfeited estates, absorbed the debts of struggling nobles, and slowly expanded his personal domains until he owned a staggering percentage of the kingdom's land, all while wearing the vestments of a humble servant of God. The psychological impact of this dominance on the royal family was profound and corrosive. Henry V, for all his martial glory, was acutely aware that his ability to wage war existed only by the grace of his uncle's purse. The king was the hero of the narrative, the face of the nation, but behind the scenes, he was often reduced to negotiating terms with Beaufort like a common merchant. This dynamic created a tension that simmered beneath the surface of their relationship, a silent power struggle where the king wielded the sword and the Cardinal held the purse strings, and in the long, grinding attrition of the Middle Ages, the purse was often mightier than the sword. Beaufort's role as the financier of the war also meant that he had a vested interest in the continuation of the conflict. Peace was bad for business, a cessation of hostilities meant a stop to the subsidies, the ransoms, and the urgent need for his liquidity. There were whispers in the corridors of Westminster that the Cardinal used his influence to sabotage peace treaties, pushing the council to reject compromises that might have ended the bloodshed. To him, the war was a magnificent enterprise, a churn of chaos that allowed a man of his unique talents to rise above the station of his birth. He was feeding the beast of war because the beast fed him, gorging itself on the lives of peasants and knights while he grew fat on the proceeds. As the years turned into decades, the Cardinal's identity became entirely consumed by his gold. He was no longer just a churchman or a politician, he was an institution, a fourth estate, unto himself. The stain of his illegitimate birth had been gilded over so thoroughly that it was blinding to look upon. He had proven that while he could not be king by right of blood, he could be the master of kings by right of debt. He walked the halls of power with an arrogance that terrified his enemies, for they knew that to strike at Beaufort was to strike at the financial foundation of England itself. He had made himself too big to fail centuries before the concept existed, weaving his assets so deeply into the fabric of the state that his ruin would mean the collapse of the monarchy. Yet, this power came at a terrible spiritual cost, a corrosion of the soul that went unnoticed amidst the triumphs of the world. In his pursuit of earthly security, Beaufort had become a creature of the material plane, his eyes fixed so firmly on the ledger that he lost sight of the crucifix. He had justified his usury as necessity, his warmongering as patriotism, and his avarice as stewardship, building a fortress of rationalizations to protect his conscience. But the gold was cold comfort in the quiet hours of the night, and as he aged, the vibrant red of his cardinal's robes began to look less like the blood of martyrs and more like the blood of the soldiers who had died to pay his interest rates. By the time Henry V passed away, leaving an infant heir and a power vacuum, Beaufort was arguably the most powerful man in Europe. He had survived the purges, the plagues, and the battlefields, standing as the last great pillar of the Lancastrian dynasty. But the foundation of his house was built on the shifting sands of debt and death. He had bought the kingdom, just as he had vowed to do when the crown was denied to him, but in the process, he had transformed England into a subsidiary of his own ambition. The rich Cardinal had everything a man could desire, except the one thing he could not buy: clean hands. His legacy was written in gold, but it was signed in blood, setting the stage for the tragedy that would unfold when the debts finally came due. With the ascension of his great-nephew, the charismatic and steely-eyed Henry V, in the year 1413, Cardinal Beaufort found himself in a position of paradoxical complexity. On the surface, this was the dawn of a golden age for the House of Lancaster, a moment where the usurping dynasty finally produced a monarch who looked and acted like a legend come to life. The young king was a paragon of medieval virtue, a warrior saint who combined religious fervor with a terrifying military competence, and Beaufort was his rock, the grand statesman standing just behind the throne. To the court and the commons, they appeared as a unified front, the sword of England and the purse of the church, marching in lockstep to reclaim the lost glory of the realm. However, beneath the polished veneer of statecraft and the triumphant fanfares of the coronation, a deep and dangerous fissure was forming between the two men. Henry V was not his father, a man haunted by guilt and prone to compromise. He was a monarch of absolute conviction who believed his authority came directly from God, not from the machinations of his wealthy relatives. He was young, physically robust, and possessed of an iron will that chafed against any attempt at manipulation. For a man like Beaufort, who viewed kings as chess pieces to be moved by the hand of finance, this independence was not merely an annoyance, it was an existential threat to his design for power. The Cardinal had spent decades cultivating influence, weaving a web of debt and obligation that ensnared the entire aristocracy, but he found that Henry V could not be bought, only rented. The king accepted Beaufort's gold to fund his great invasion of France, but he treated it as his royal due rather than a favor to be repaid with political concessions. Every loan provided by the Cardinal was swallowed by the voracious appetite of the war machine, yet the political leverage Beaufort expected in return failed to materialize. The young king listened to his uncle's counsel only when it suited him, and he was ruthlessly efficient in reminding the churchmen that in England, the crown stood above the mitre. The tension reached its zenith with the miraculous victory at Agincourt in the year 1415, an event that canonized Henry V in the eyes of his people. When the news reached London of how a starving, dysentery-ridden English band had shattered the flower of French chivalry, the king was elevated to a status bordering on divinity. For Beaufort, this triumph was a double-edged sword of the sharpest kind. While it secured the investments he had made in the campaign, it also made the king untouchable. A monarch who has been kissed by unsuspecting victory on the battlefield does not need to listen to the whispers of an old bishop in the council chamber. As the war dragged on, transforming from a glorious crusade into a grinding occupation of northern France, the dynamic between the two men grew increasingly cold. Henry was spending years across the Channel, building an Anglo-French empire, becoming more autonomous and more demanding with each passing season. He began to curb the privileges of the church and question the vast accumulation of wealth in the hands of clerics like his uncle. Beaufort, watching from Westminster, saw the writing on the wall: as long as this vigorous, competent, and beloved king lived, the cardinal would remain a servant, a glorified banker kept in a gilded cage, never the true master of the realm he felt destined to rule. It was in this climate of simmering resentment that the events of the year 1422 began to unfold, events that would change the course of history and stain Beaufort's reputation forever. The king, at the height of his power, having just secured the Treaty of Troyes and been named the heir and regent of France, was campaigning near the lawyer when he fell ill. It was August, a month of stifling heat and pestilence, and the royal camp at the Château de Vincennes became a breeding ground for disease. The official reports claimed it was the bloody flux, or dysentery, a common and unglamorous killer of soldiers, but the speed and ferocity of the king's decline shocked everyone who witnessed it. Henry V was a man of only 35 years, hardened by campaign life and possessed of a constitution that had survived the rigors of forced marches and winter sieges. Yet, within a matter of weeks, this titan was reduced to a skeletal wreck, unable to sit on his horse, his body purging itself of life with a violence that defied medical explanation. The royal physicians were helpless, their potions and prayers doing nothing to halt the disintegration of the king's organs. To the inner circle, the progression of the illness seemed unnaturally rapid, a catastrophic collapse that looked less like the work of nature and more like the result of a malevolent intervention. In the shadowed corridors of power, whispers began to circulate before the king had even drawn his last breath, dark rumors that the bloody flux was a convenient fiction designed to mask the symptoms of a potent poison. The finger of suspicion pointed not to the French enemies, who were too disorganized to strike such a blow, but back across the channel to the one man who had the most to gain from the king's demise. People remembered the friction between the uncle and the nephew, the cardinal's insatiable ambition, and his history of removing obstacles. It was whispered that the symptoms, the burning thirst, the agonizing stomach cramps, the blackening of the skin, mimicked the effects of arsenic or nightshade, substances well known to men of learning and high station. The motive was glaringly obvious to anyone who understood the politics of the Lancaster court. Henry V was a barrier, his son, born only months earlier, was a key. If the king were to die, the crown would pass to an infant, a babe in arms who could not rule, could not speak, and could not lead armies. A minority reign meant a regency council, a vacuum of authority that a powerful, wealthy, and politically astute man like Cardinal Beaufort could easily dominate. By trading a strong, willful king for a helpless baby, the cardinal would effectively become the uncrowned monarch of two kingdoms, holding the reins of power for at least 16 years until the boy came of age. As the king lay dying in the sweltering heat of Vincennes, drifting in and out of delirium, Beaufort was notably absent from the bedside, busy securing his position in England. This absence was interpreted by his detractors as the cold calculation of a man who knew exactly what was happening and preferred to establish his alibi hundreds of miles away. The cardinal's agents were everywhere, and the network of spies and servants he maintained could easily have facilitated the administration of a tainted cup or a poisoned meal. In the cutthroat world of 15th-century politics, the line between a natural death and a political assassination was often blurred, and Beaufort thrived in that ambiguity. When the end finally came on the 31st of August, 1422, the grief of the nation was overwhelming, but the relief of the cardinal was palpable to those who knew where to look. The hero of Agincourt, the conqueror of France, was dead, leaving behind a power vacuum of epic proportions. The Saint in Red, as some sarcastically called Beaufort, immediately moved to fill that void. He did not weep for the loss of a nephew, he prepared for the acquisition of a kingdom. The speed with which he consolidated his influence over the Regency Council suggested a man who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. The rumors of poison never truly vanished, they merely went underground, festering in the tavern talk and the private letters of the nobility. They became part of the dark legend of Cardinal Beaufort, a stain on his scarlet robes that no amount of holy water could wash away. It was said that he had sacrificed the greatest king England had ever known upon the altar of his own vanity, trading national glory for personal control. The death of Henry V was the turning point, the moment when the Lancastrian dream began to rot from within, poisoned, perhaps literally, by the very men who claimed to support it. The transition of power was seamless, almost too seamless to be accidental. The infant Henry VI was proclaimed King of England and France, a tiny, fragile figure who would become the perfect vessel for Beaufort's ambitions. The cardinal could now mold the monarch from the cradle, instilling loyalty and dependence, ensuring that the boy would grow up to be the pliable instrument that his father refused to be. It was a monstrous gamble, sacrificing the present strength of the state for future control, but to a man like Beaufort, who viewed history in terms of assets and liabilities, the liquidation of Henry V was simply a necessary restructure of the enterprise. Thus, the realm entered a long twilight of regency, presided over by the brooding figure of the cardinal. He had won the war for the throne without ever lifting a sword, defeating the warrior king with patience and, if the rumors were true, a few drops of tasteless liquid. But in doing so, he had sown the seeds of his own destruction and the destruction of the dynasty. The ghost of Vincennes would haunt the corridors of the English court for decades, a silent accuser pointing a finger at the uncle who survived. The natural causes that took Henry V were accepted by the history books, but in the hearts of the suspicious, it remained the perfect murder, a crime committed by a man too rich to be questioned and too holy to be suspected. The era of the hero was over, the era of the vampire had begun. Beaufort now stood at the pinnacle of his career, the guardian of the child king, the master of the treasury, and the de facto ruler of the dual monarchy. Yet, as he looked upon the cradle of the new king, he must have felt the chill of the grave he had just filled. He had cleared the path to absolute power, but the path was slippery with blood, and the shadows in the corners of his palace seemed to grow longer and darker, as if the demons he would later see on his own deathbed were already gathering, waiting for the interest on his sins to come due. If the death of Henry V was a sudden, violent thunderclap that shook the foundations of the realm, the fate of his young widow, Catherine of Valois, was a slow, suffocating fog that descended upon the court, chilling the blood of those who watched it unfold. She was a woman of only 21 years when she was left alone in a foreign land, a French princess who had been the prize of a treaty, now transformed into a dowager queen with a heart full of unspent love and a womb that had proven its fertility. In the eyes of a normal man, she was a figure of sympathy and grace, a young mother grieving her hero husband, but to Cardinal Henry Beaufort, she represented a terrifying political variable that could not be allowed to roam free. Beaufort looked upon Catherine not as a niece by marriage, but as a loose thread in the carefully woven tapestry of his regency, a thread that, if pulled by the wrong hand, could unravel his entire design for England. A dowager queen was a prize of immense value in the marriage market of Europe. Whoever married her would become the stepfather to the infant king, gaining a proximity to the throne that would rival, and perhaps eclipse, the cardinal's own influence. Beaufort knew that if Catherine were to wed a powerful English magnate, perhaps even his rival the Duke of Gloucester, the balance of power would shift catastrophically, and his grip on the young Henry VI would be broken by a new father figure. To prevent this disaster, the cardinal orchestrated one of the most callous pieces of legislation in English history, a parliamentary act passed in the year 1427 that was designed specifically to cage a single woman. The statute forbade the dowager queen from marrying without the express consent of the king and his council, a consent that Beaufort, as the dominant voice of that council, would never grant. It was a golden chain wrapped around her neck, a legal maneuver that condemned a vibrant young woman to a life of enforced celibacy and isolation, stripping her of her autonomy under the guise of protecting the dignity of the crown. But Catherine was a daughter of France, possessing a spirit that was not easily quelled by the dry ink of English laws, and her desire for human connection led her into the shadows that Beaufort watched so closely. Denied a dynastic marriage, she found solace in the arms of Owen Tudor, a Welsh squire of low birth whose lack of political standing made him seem like a safe harbor in the tempest of the court. It was a secret romance, hidden behind the tapestries and in the private closets of her household, a desperate rebellion of the heart against the cold machinery of the state. However, in the cardinal's world, there were no secrets, only intelligence waiting to be gathered by his army of spies. When whispers of the queen's indiscretions reached the ears of the cardinal, his reaction was not one of moral outrage, but of cold, strategic fury. He saw in this secret union not a love story, but a threat of a different kind, the possibility of a new, half-royal brood of children who might one day challenge the succession or dilute the Lancastrian bloodline. The existence of these bastard step-siblings to the king was a complication Beaufort refused to tolerate. He began a systematic campaign to dismantle Catherine's life, a process of persecution that was as psychological as it was political, designed to break her spirit and drive her into the ground. The queen found herself gradually stripped of her household, her trusted French ladies dismissed one by one and replaced with stern English matrons who reported every breath she took to Winchester Palace. The air in her chambers grew heavy with suspicion. She could not speak without fear of being overheard, nor eat without the trembling thought that her food might be tampered with. Beaufort was isolating her, cutting the cords of support that kept her tethered to sanity, turning her own home into a luxurious prison where the walls had ears and the servants had cold eyes. The cruelest blow came when the cardinal moved to separate Catherine from her son, the young King Henry VI, under the pretense that her influence was too French and softening for a boy destined to rule two warrior nations. He placed the boy under the tutelage of hard men loyal to the Beaufort faction, effectively orphaning the child while his mother was still alive. Catherine was relegated to the periphery, allowed to see her son only on formal occasions, forced to watch from a distance as the cardinal molded the boy's mind, instilling in him a pious detachment that mirrored Beaufort's public persona, if not his private soul. Deprived of her husband, her lover, and her child, Catherine's health began to fail with a rapidity that alarmed those few friends she had left. It was not a sudden fever, but a slow, inexorable wilting, as if the life force was simply leaking out of her. Her complexion turned the color of parchment, her once bright eyes grew dull and sunken, and a persistent lethargy took hold of her limbs. The court physicians, men whose salaries were often paid by the cardinal's treasury, offered vague diagnoses of melancholy and female hysteria, prescribing treatments that seemed to drain her strength rather than restore it. Rumors began to circulate in the dark taverns of London and the nervous corridors of Windsor that the Queen was suffering from something far more sinister than a broken heart. People whispered that the cardinal, having successfully removed the father, was now erasing the mother to ensure his total ownership of the king. The symptoms she displayed, the hair loss, the abdominal pains, the metallic taste in her mouth, bore a frightening resemblance to the effects of slow-acting poisons, substances administered in minute doses over months to mimic a natural decline. It was the perfect crime for a man of patience, a murder that looked like grief. As the year 1436 turned to 37, Catherine was moved to Bermondsey Abbey, a transfer that was publicly framed as a retirement for her health but felt to all observers like a final incarceration. The abbey was cold and damp, a place of silence and stone, far removed from the warmth of the royal palaces. Here, under the guise of spiritual care, she was completely cut off from the world, surrounded by nuns and monks who answered to the Bishop of Winchester. The cardinal had effectively buried her alive, removing the embarrassment of her presence from his court while she still drew breath. In the solitude of the abbey, Catherine's condition deteriorated into a nightmare of pain and delirium. She was tormented by visions of her children, both the king she had lost to Beaufort's ambition and the secret Tudor infants she had been forced to hide. The isolation was absolute. There were no champions left to fight for her, no knights to storm the abbey walls. She was a woman fighting a war against the richest men in England with nothing but her frailty, and it was a war she was destined to lose. The cardinal did not need to wield a knife, he simply needed to wait, and let the cold, the stress, and the medicines do their work. On the 3rd of January, 1437, the end finally came for the Dowager Queen. She died not in the silk sheets of a royal bed, but in the austere gloom of a convent, her body wasted away to a skeletal husk. The official proclamation cited a long illness, a natural tragedy of a woman too weak for this world. But those who saw the body before it was sealed in the tomb noted the look of anguish etched onto her face, a frozen scream of a mother torn from her young. Beaufort's reaction to the news was a masterclass in composed hypocrisy. He ordered a lavish funeral, paying for masses to be sung for her soul, purchasing his public absolution with the very gold that had funded her oppression. He wore the mask of the grieving uncle, but in the privacy of his council, there was a palpable sense of business concluded. The threat of a rival stepfather was gone, the embarrassment of her secret marriage was silenced, the influence of the mother was extinguished. The board was cleared, and the king was now entirely his. Yet, the ghost of Catherine of Valois would not rest so easily. Her death added another layer to the dark legend of the cardinal, another story of a life consumed by his insatiable need for control. The common people, who had loved their French queen, looked at the red-robed prelate with deepening fear. They saw a man who devoured his own family to feed his ambition, a shepherd who slaughtered the ewes to control the lambs. The natural death of the queen was accepted by the records, but in the collective memory of the time, it was marked as another victim of the Winchester poison, a slow and silent venom that killed not just the body, but the hope of the realm. Beaufort stood over her grave at Westminster, victorious once again, but he did not see the irony that would later come to haunt his legacy. In his ruthless drive to destroy Catherine's line and secure the Lancastrian hold, he had inadvertently pushed the Tudor seat into the shadows, where it would survive, harden, and eventually return to claim the very crown he had spent his life protecting. But for now, in the cold winter of 1437, the cardinal was supreme, standing alone on a summit built of corpses, oblivious to the fact that the higher he climbed, the longer the shadow he cast, and the darker the demons that awaited him at the end. By the winter of the year 1447, the long and bitter game of chess that had defined English politics for decades was drawing to its inexorable close. Cardinal Henry Beaufort, now an ancient man by the standards of his time, sat at the very pinnacle of the realm's hierarchy, his influence stretching from the Vatican to the remotest shires of England. Yet, there remained one final piece on the board that refused to be swept away, a stubborn obstacle that had plagued him for 25 years, his own nephew, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Gloucester was the youngest brother of the hero King Henry V, a man who styled himself as the protector of the realm, and the champion of the common people, a populist figure whose very existence was an affront to the cardinal's vision of absolute, centralized control. The rivalry between the uncle and the nephew was more than a political dispute, it was a clash of fundamental philosophies that had torn the House of Lancaster apart from within. Gloucester was a man of the Renaissance before it had fully arrived in England, a patron of scholars, a collector of books, and a loud advocate for a vigorous, aggressive foreign policy against France. He represented the old martial spirit of Agincourt, and the London mobs loved him for it, cheering "Good Duke Humphrey" whenever he rode through the streets. To Beaufort, however, Humphrey was a dangerous loose cannon, a warmonger who did not understand the subtle art of diplomacy and a demagogue who threatened the stability of the fragile peace the Cardinal was trying to construct with the French crown. Determined to extinguish this last flame of resistance, Beaufort orchestrated a masterstroke of political theater that was designed to isolate and destroy the Duke once and for all. He convinced the weak-willed King Henry VI to call a parliament not in London, where Gloucester's armed supporters could easily intimidate the court, but in the remote and heavily fortified town of Bury Street, Edmonds in Suffolk. The location was a trap, plain and simple, situated deep within the territory controlled by the Cardinal's allies. The town was turned into an armed camp, the streets patrolled by men wearing the liveries of Beaufort's faction, creating an atmosphere of menace that hung heavy in the freezing February air. When the Duke of Gloucester arrived at Bury on the 18th of February, 1447, he rode into the lion's den with a naivety that was heartbreaking to behold. He believed in the sanctity of his blood, thinking that as the king's uncle and the heir presumptive to the throne, he was untouchable. He did not see the invisible noose that had already been tightened around his neck, nor did he realize that the Cardinal had finally decided that the Duke was worth more dead than alive. The greeting he received was cold and perfunctory, and within hours of his arrival, the trap was sprung with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long and careful planning. Before he could even unpack his baggage or take his seat in the Parliament chamber, Duke Humphrey was arrested on charges of high treason. The accusation was a fabrication, a monstrous lie concocted by the Cardinal's agents, claiming that the Duke plotted to kill the king and seize the crown for himself. The shock of the arrest reverberated through the town, but there was no one to rise in his defense. His retinue was stripped from him, his servants were dispersed, and the good Duke was dragged away to solitary confinement in St. Saviour's Hospital, a prisoner in the very kingdom he had once governed. For 5 days, silence descended upon the hospital where the last son of Henry IV sat in darkness, cut off from the world he had tried to save. What transpired behind those locked doors remains one of the darkest mysteries of the Middle Ages, a secret buried in the heart of the Beaufort conspiracy. The Cardinal did not visit his nephew, there was no need for words between them anymore. Beaufort knew that a public trial of the popular Duke would be a disaster, likely sparking riots in London and perhaps even a rebellion. A living prisoner was a liability, a rallying point for every malcontent in England, but a dead Duke was merely a tragedy to be mourned and then forgotten. On the morning of the 23rd of February, the announcement was made that Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, had passed away in his sleep. The official cause of death was given as a stroke or palsy, brought on by the shock of his arrest and the weight of his grief. The timing was impeccable, almost miraculous in its convenience for the Cardinal. Just as the difficult questions of a trial were about to be raised, the defendant had simply ceased to exist, removing the need for evidence, witnesses, or a verdict. The problem had solved itself, or so the official narrative claimed, with a tidiness that made the blood of cynical men run cold. However, when the body was displayed to the Parliament and the public to prove that he had died of natural causes, the whispers began almost immediately. Those who filed past the bier noted that the Duke's face was twisted in a rictus of agony, not the peaceful repose of a man who had drifted away in slumber. There were no external marks of violence on his skin, no stab wounds, no bruises from a garrote, but this only fueled the darker rumors that were spreading like wildfire through the nervous crowds. The medieval mind knew well the methods of killing that left no trace, the smothering with a soft feather mattress, the insertion of a red-hot spit where it would not be seen, or the subtle administration of a poison that stopped the heart without spilling blood. The name on everyone's lips, spoken in hushed tones in the alehouses and the marketplaces, was Beaufort. It was said that the Cardinal had finally done what he had always threatened to do, he had acted as the hand of God, pruning the family tree of its rotten branch. The speed of the death, the isolation of the victim, and the immense benefit that accrued to the Beaufort faction pointed to a premeditated murder. The Cardinal had not just defeated his rival, he had erased him, ensuring that there was no one left in England with the stature or the lineage to challenge his authority over the king. With Gloucester gone, Henry Beaufort stood alone at the summit of his power, a colossus who had outlived and outmaneuvered every contemporary who had dared to oppose him. He had defeated the heroics of Henry V, the dynastic claims of Catherine of Valois, and now the popularity of the Duke of Gloucester. He was the survivor of a brutal game of elimination, the last great figure of the Lancastrian dynasty's founding generation. The king, Henry VI, was now entirely his creature, a pious and fragile puppet dancing on the strings that the cardinal held firmly in his withered hands. The wealth that flowed into the cardinal's coffers in the wake of Gloucester's demise was staggering. He absorbed the duke's estates, his influence, and his position, consolidating a monopoly on power that was unprecedented in English history. Beaufort was now the uncrowned king, the man who decided who lived and who died, who rose and who fell. He looked out over a kingdom that was ostensibly at peace, but it was the peace of the graveyard, a silence purchased with the lives of his own kin. He believed he had won the ultimate victory, proving that gold and guile were stronger than steel and popularity. Yet, even as he basked in the glow of his triumph, the cardinal began to feel the weight of his own mortality pressing down upon him. He was 72 years old, an ancient age for a man who had lived such a stressful existence, and he knew that his time was running out. In a desperate attempt to launder his soul and by the forgiveness of the Almighty, he poured his blood-soaked gold into the construction of great religious works. He expanded Winchester Cathedral, endowing chantries and hiring armies of priests to sing masses for his salvation, believing that the sheer volume of his charity could drown out the screams of the ghosts that haunted his conscience. He built the Hospital of St. Cross, a charitable institution for the poor, styling it the almshouse of noble poverty, a deeply ironic name given that his own noble poverty of spirit had caused so much suffering. He gave lavishly to the church, trying to bribe St. Peter just as he had bribed the parliaments of England. He seemed to believe that there was a transaction for everything, that the sins of regicide and fratricide could be balanced on the celestial ledger if the pile of gold on the other side was high enough. He was a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing, attempting to negotiate a commercial treaty with God. But the victory over Gloucester tasted like ash in his mouth. The good duke was dead, but in death, he became a martyr, his memory hallowed by the people who now looked at the cardinal with undisguised hatred. Beaufort had won the power, but he had lost the argument of history. He walked the corridors of his palaces surrounded by sycophants who feared him, but he was utterly alone, isolated by the very ruthlessness that had brought him to the top. The mountain of gold he sat upon was cold comfort against the encroaching dark, and the shadows in the corners of his room seemed to take the shape of the nephew he had just buried. It was a terrifying peak to stand upon, a summit built of corpses, where the air was too thin to breathe. The cardinal had cleared the board, but in doing so, he had removed all the supports that held up the house of Lancaster. He did not realize that by destroying Gloucester, the protector, he had destroyed the last barrier protecting the dynasty from the chaos that was to come. He had won the battle for himself, but he had doomed his family to the Wars of the Roses. And now, with his enemies vanquished and his coffers full, there was nothing left for Henry Beaufort to do but to face the one adversary who could not be poisoned, bribed, or imprisoned, his own approaching death. The irony was cosmic and cruel. The great cardinal survived his final rival by only 6 weeks. It was as if the universe had allowed him just enough time to savor his victory before snatching it away, proving the futility of his earthly ambitions. He had spent a lifetime climbing a ladder of bones to reach the heavens, only to find that the ladder led nowhere but down into the abyss. As the spring of 1447 turned towards April, the conqueror began to crumble, his body failing him just as he achieved absolute dominion, leaving him to face the judgment he had spent a fortune trying to avoid. The final act of this grand and tragic historical drama was not staged in the cavernous majesty of the Westminster throne room, nor amidst the chanting choirs of the great cathedrals Beaufort had endowed. Instead, the curtain fell in the oppressive, claustrophobic confinement of a bedchamber in the bishop's palace at Winchester. The date was the 11th of April, 1447, a Tuesday that dawned with a pale, indifferent light filtering through the leaded glass windows. The room was stiflingly hot, the air thick with the smoke of braziers kept burning to ward off the chill of death, and heavy with the sickly sweet aroma of medicinal herbs that had long since ceased to be effective. In the center of this suffocating tableau lay Henry Beaufort, the Cardinal of England, a man who had spent 8 decades accumulating the world, now reduced to a trembling heap of bones fighting for a single breath of air. The transformation of the man was shocking to those who had known him in his prime. The Saint in Red, who had once terrified parliaments with a single scowl and commanded armies with the stroke of a quill, was now a fragile husk, his skin stretched tight over a skull that seemed eager to reveal itself. His eyes, once sharp and calculating as those of a hawk, were now wide and glassy, darting frantically around the room as if tracking the flight of invisible birds. The attendants, standing in the shadows, watched with a mixture of pity and revulsion as the most powerful men in the realm waged a futile war against the one adversary that could not be outmaneuvered. It was a pathetic spectacle of mortal weakness, stripping away the layers of pomp and circumstance to reveal the terrified animal beneath the crimson robes. As the delirium of the final hours set in, the Cardinal's mind began to fracture, the barriers between past and present dissolving into a chaotic stream of consciousness. According to the chronicles of the time, including the accounts of those who stood by his bedside, Beaufort did not turn his thoughts to prayer or repentance in these final moments. Instead, his lifelong obsession with wealth and transaction asserted itself with a grotesque intensity. He began to bargain with the empty air, his voice a rasping whisper that rose to a desperate shriek, demanding to know why he must die when he had the means to pay for life. He was not pleading for salvation, he was trying to negotiate a contract extension, believing in his delirium that the laws of biology were just as corruptible as the laws of men. "And will not death be hired?" he reportedly cried out, clutching the velvet coverlet with fingers that looked like bird claws. "Will money do nothing? When I die, surely the whole realm will perish. If I could but live, I would give the treasury of England." It was a moment of profound and tragic irony. The man who had bought kings, popes, and peace treaties was now offering the entirety of his immense fortune for just a few more days, perhaps even hours, of existence. He could not comprehend that the currency he had worshipped for so long held no value in the jurisdiction he was about to enter. The gold stored in his vaults, enough to build fleets and raise cathedrals, was now as useless as the dust gathering in the corners of the room. The witnesses to this spectacle were horrified, crossing themselves as they listened to the Cardinal try to bribe the Reaper. It was a terrifying glimpse into the soul of a man who had completely hollowed himself out in the pursuit of power, leaving nothing behind but a ledger of debts and assets. He spoke of his jewels, his plate, his manners, listing them frantically as if presenting a manifesto of his worth, unable to grasp that he was being audited on a different scale entirely. The tragedy was not just that he was dying, but that he was dying without understanding the first thing about life, that its value could not be measured in marks and nobles. He was a merchant trying to buy water in the middle of the ocean, drowning in his own liquidity. Then, as the shadows in the room lengthened and the candles burned low, the nature of his hallucinations shifted from bargaining to terror. The room, already crowded with priests and physicians, seemed to fill with other figures, silent and accusing, emerging from the dark corners of the Cardinal's memory. These were not the angels come to escort a prince of the church to heaven, they were the ghosts of the family he had destroyed to secure his position. Beaufort began to recoil from the foot of his bed, his eyes fixed on empty space, screaming names that had not been spoken aloud in the palace for years. The guilt that he had suppressed under layers of justification and ambition was finally erupting, taking on a terrifying visual form. First among the specters was the imposing figure of Henry V, the warrior king whose premature death had opened the door for Beaufort's regency. In the flickering candlelight, the Cardinal seemed to see the hero of Agincourt standing before him, not in his glory, but in the agony of his final sickness at Vincennes. The accusation in the dead king's eyes was clear, a silent question about the bloody flux that had conveniently removed him from the board. Beaufort thrashed against his pillows, muttering denials to the phantom, trying to explain the necessity of the act, the political expediency that had required the sacrifice of the nephew for the stability of the realm. But the ghost of the king remained, a towering monument to the Cardinal's betrayal of his own blood. Then came the vision of Catherine of Valois, the beautiful French queen he had tormented and isolated. He saw her not as the vibrant princess she had been, but as the wasted, skeletal figure who had died in the gloom of Bermondsey Abbey. She did not speak, but her presence was a suffocating weight on the Cardinal's chest, a reminder of the cruel laws he had written to cage her and the cold indifference with which he had watched her fade away. Her silent stare stripped away the facade of the protective uncle, revealing him as the jailer who had crushed a mother to keep control of her son. The memory of her suffering, which he had dismissed as a necessary political maneuver, now returned as a personal haunting, a debt of cruelty that was demanding repayment. But the most terrifying apparition was the freshest one, the ghost of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Dead for only 6 weeks, the memory of the good Duke was a raw and bleeding wound in the Cardinal's conscience. Beaufort screamed as if he saw his nephew's face hovering just inches from his own, twisted in the same rictus of pain that had marked his corpse at Bury St. Edmunds. This was the final crime, the fratricide that had sealed Beaufort's doom. He had killed the protector to secure his own safety, but in doing so, he had summoned a demon that would not let him rest. He clawed at the air, trying to push away the vision of the men he had murdered, but the ghost of Gloucester was relentless, a silent witness to the fact that the cardinal's hands were stained with the blood of his own kin. The physiological breakdown of the dying man accelerated, his breathing becoming a ragged, wet rattle that filled the silence of the room. The sweat pouring from his brow was cold, and his skin took on the grey, waxen pallor of the grave. Yet, even in this extremity, there was no peace, no acceptance. The priests tried to administer the last rites, holding the crucifix before his eyes and chanting the prayers for the dying, but Beaufort seemed unable to see the cross. His gaze was fixed on something beyond the physical world, something that caused his body to convulse in spasms of pure, primal fear. He was not looking at the gates of paradise, he was looking into a vast, dark abyss where his gold could not follow him. It was in these final seconds that the true horror of his situation dawned upon him with the force of a revelation. He realized that the immense fortune he had spent his life amassing was not a shield, but an anchor. The gold, the silver, the deeds to the estates, everything he had prioritized over his soul, seemed to transmute in his mind into lead, a colossal weight that was dragging him down. He felt himself sinking, pulled into the darkness by the very success he had achieved. The rich cardinal was drowning in his riches, and the realization brought forth a grimace of animal terror that froze on his face, a mask of ultimate despair that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. This was not the death of a Christian prelate, confident in the mercy of God, it was the death of a man who suddenly understands he has made a terrible, irreversible mistake. He saw, perhaps, that in his ruthless pursuit of earthly power, he had become the architect of his own damnation. The demons he had dismissed as superstition were now the only reality left to him, and they were coming to collect the one thing he had never valued, his soul. He tried to speak one last time, perhaps to offer another bribe, perhaps to beg for a second chance, but the words died in his throat, choked off by the rising tide of death. With a final, convulsing shudder, Henry Beaufort ceased to breathe. The tension in the room snapped, leaving behind a silence that was heavy with the smell of mortality and fear. But the look on the corpse's face remained fixed, a stare of wide-eyed horror, as if he had seen the devil himself waiting at the foot of the bed. It was a grotesque end for the most powerful man in Europe, a confirmation that for all his cunning and accumulation, he had lost the only game that mattered. He had died as he lived, grasping, fearful, and ultimately alone in a room full of people who were already calculating how to divide his spoils. Almost immediately after his last breath, the looting began. The servants and retainers, following the example set by their master throughout his life, stripped the room of everything of value, tearing the rings from his cooling fingers and emptying the chests of plate. It was a fitting eulogy for a man who had taught the world that greed was the only virtue. They picked his carcass clean before he was even cold, a pack of scavengers feeding on the remains of a predator. The great cardinal, who had commanded the respect of kings, was reduced to a piece of meat to be plundered, his dignity vanishing along with his spirit. But the true legacy of Henry Beaufort was not the gold that was stolen from his deathbed, it was the ruin he left behind. He had spent 50 years systematically destroying anyone who could challenge his authority, removing the strong, the capable, and the legitimate, until only he remained. Now that he was gone, there was no one left to hold the center. He had eliminated the hero King Henry V, crushed the capable Queen Catherine, and murdered the popular Duke of Gloucester, leaving the throne in the hands of the weak, unstable, and holy Henry VI, a king who was utterly incapable of ruling without the cardinal's iron hand. By wiping out his own family to secure his power, Beaufort had created a vacuum that nature, and the ambitious nobles of England, would rush to fill. He had removed the supports of the House of Lancaster, believing he was strengthening the structure, when in reality he was knocking out the pillars. With Gloucester dead and the king feeble, the rival House of York, led by men who had watched Beaufort's tyranny with growing anger, saw their opportunity to strike. The stability that the cardinal had enforced with gold and poison evaporated the moment his heart stopped beating. Thus, the death of Henry Beaufort was not just the end of a man, it was the beginning of the end for medieval England. The seeds of discord he had sown, the factionalism, the normalization of political murder, the weakness of the crown, were about to sprout into a harvest of blood. He had left the door to the kingdom unlocked and unguarded, inviting the chaos that would become known as the Wars of the Roses. As his body was prepared for burial in the great cathedral he had expanded, England stood unknowingly on the precipice of 30 years of civil war, a slaughter that would wash away the old nobility and the world Beaufort had known. In the end, the cardinal had bought nothing but destruction. His gold had purchased a civil war, His ambition had purchased the ruin of his dynasty, and his ruthlessness had purchased a one-way ticket to the darkness he had so feared in his final moments. He lay in his tomb, a monument to the futility of power without conscience, while above him, the storm clouds of the coming conflict gathered over a land he had exploited, broken, and finally abandoned to the wolves. The history books would remember him as the rich cardinal, but the ghosts he left behind knew him as the men who sold the soul of England and got nothing in return but a terrifying glimpse of hell.